Good morning, everybody. As Kurt said, my name is Nelson Neal, and I have the pleasure of leading a couple of functions at CHS based out of the Twin Cities, Minneapolis. First is CHS Hedging, and the second is our new commodity trade advisor called CHS Market Advisors. Provides advisory services and the like to commercial agricultural entities and farmers alike. So, a couple of housekeeping rules before we jump into it, and maybe just one major housekeeping rule, and that is I like to be interactive, right? So if you don't come at me with questions or comments, sometimes I call on people in the audience. It's a very uncomfortable position to be in, but that's sometimes what I do. If I do ask you a question and you don't know the answer, just give me the shake off sign and we'll move on to somebody else. But I wanted to spend the next 40 minutes or so talking about what's next for agriculture. There is absolutely, positively a lot going on in the space in which you operate. And that's what we want to spend our time here this morning on. And really I want to cover 6 what I would call key topics of change in agriculture. Some of these are becoming more mature, but number one, I want to start off with a quick look at the past. I think you'll be engaged with that section. Spend a little bit of time talking about the macroeconomy, because now more than ever, what's happening in the broader market, in the equities market, in the bonds market impacts you. Perhaps more so now than at any time over the last 30 to 40 years. We'll talk about changes in political structure and what that may mean for agriculture. Then we'll talk about what's happening globally with ag. Talk about U.S. exports and what the future portends for exports with changing dynamics with Brazil and China. We'll talk a little bit about biofuels in the form of agri-energy, where we are today, where we've been, and where we might be going. And then we'll close out with a quick section on as the ag cycle turns. We've come out of a peak, and now we're heading back into a trough. And what does that mean for the management of your acres and ultimately your margin? Is everybody good with these 6 topics? Anything we're missing? Okay, let's jump right into it. So I've got this first section titled The Past is Prologue, and this is a bit of an appetizer for you to get you warmed up. Anybody read a gentleman by the name of Neil Howell? Neil Howell, he talks about turnings in events, changes in society, institutions, and the like. So he wrote this book called The Fourth Turning, and he divides history up into basically a long lifetime, 80 to 100 years, and talks about the phases of society. Anyway, it's an interesting book. I'm kind of in the middle of it. But it got me thinking, are there parallels between what is happening today globally and also in agriculture, and can we tie it to things we've seen in the past? And it's a little bit uncanny in terms of how you can begin to tie some of these things in the past or to the past. So let's go ahead and I'm going to offer up a couple of photographs to you, and you get to describe them for me. Fair? All right. Here's the first one. What's happening in this photo? Protests, right? 1970s, New York City. And what are they upset about? They're upset about inflation. That's right. Sound familiar? Picture number 2. Probably more applicable to maybe a year ago. Things have pulled off a little bit, but also in that 1970s session, or that era, say early 1970s up to 80 or 81, 82, we had inflation with fuel prices, right? Oil embargoes and the like. Photograph number 3. Anybody remember the USSR? Soviet Union, and we were at extreme Cold War odds with that particular nation. Anybody remember this guy? Who could forget? What a face, right? Ayatollah Khomeini, 1979, and he was associated with what country? Iran. So let me check I'm starting to check the boxes here. So I've got inflation, both food inflation, energy inflation, check. Discord with the Soviet Union, Russia, check. Iran popping its head up again, check. How about this photograph? If you gave these guys a haircut and maybe a shave, could you have placed this group in New York City in front of the JP Morgan Chase Bank last fall? It was 1973. The signs look familiar. And then the final photograph I'm going to show you here came from 1981. What happens roughly 3 to 4 seconds after this photograph is taken? President Ronald Reagan is shot, right? An attempted assassination. So all of this is to say, hey, there's a lot of forces at work that we've seen from an historical perspective. Can we ensure that we learn lessons as we move forward? Okay? All right. So let's talk first about what I like to call the economic tightrope. And that is a lot of macroeconomic forces are happening today. You even saw them happening somewhat in the 1970s and early 80s with spiraling inflation, stagflation, lack of growth, and so forth. But these macro drivers have and will come home to roost on your farm. That's the takeaway message here. That's why you've got to pay attention to it. Okay, you just can't concentrate all of your thoughts and focus on the ag industry because it's being influenced by those powers outside of the agricultural industry quite a bit. So let's talk about GDP in the United States. You can see the average there with the kind of orangish line. And I think what's happening in the U.S., even though we've talked a lot about recessionary forces or the potential of a recession, just hadn't happened. Just hadn't happened. In fact, our third quarter growth rate in the United States, I think the third estimate of the third quarter came in at 3.1%. It's really strong. In fact, it's above what I would call our historical norm, and you can see that from the graph. So we've got pretty strong GDP growth in the country, but we're still grappling with the forces and impacts from inflation, right? I think this topic had a lot of influence on the outcome of the most recent election in the country. And I wanted to point out here that historical perspective that I provided to you with just a couple of slides ago with the high food prices and the price sign from a local gasoline station. Look at those two big, what I would call double humps right there in the 70s, right? This is where we had early inflation, early 1970s, spiked up, came back down, and what happened? Went straight back up. We had an oil embargo that helped to fuel it. How many of you guys were around for gasoline rationing, car lines at the fuel pump? Right. So I think what your Federal Reserve is up against, as you look out to where we are today, we've seen inflation spike up to 9.1% and come back down. What they absolutely positively have to guard against is that double top that we've seen. That is the worst outcome. And it's not good for anybody. So that's why you see they cut the rate in December, because I think they signaled that they were going to cut for a long time. But as we go into 2025, those cuts may not be in the offing, right? Should that scare you? Well, not if you put things in historical context. So this graph shows you the historical Fed funds rate going back to, I think it's 1960 is where we started this graph. The true story in all of this is not where we are today in terms of the Fed funds rate. It's the fact that since we had the Great Recession, so 2008, 2009, almost present day, up to 2022, we kept rates at what? 0. That's what's not normal. The normal rate, by the way, is around 5.7%. Audience participation opportunity. This is where I'm going to call some people out. The first mortgage rate that you were able to lock in, either for your home, for your car, or for your farm. Unfortunately, you're on the front row. What was your first rate? Or what was your first mortgage rate? Or car rate, loan rate? 6 to 7%. Year? 70s. Okay. How about over here? Blue sweater, fourth row, inside. Yep. Oh, either of you. What'd you have? 8%. Anybody have double-digit rates? Oh, a few brave souls. Wow, I feel for you. But the fact is, historically, again, 5 to 6%. We're living. When rates went to zero, in my opinion, we kept them there way, way, way too long, and helped create some of the trauma we've seen here more recently. So the Fed's sitting there and trying to push down the front end of the interest rate curve, right? So they've cut the short-term interest rate. A funny thing has happened though in the last couple of months, and that is the market, who controls basically the 10-year yield, right? They've said, I've got some grave concerns about what's going on here. And all of a sudden that 10-year Treasury yield has gone in the opposite direction. You see it right there on the end of the graph. It's pushed up to like 4.6, nearly 4.7%. I think yesterday was the highest it's been since April of 2023. Did anybody see that in the news? By the way, what is the bellwether, or what do you follow when you're trying to understand where mortgage rates are going to be set, or auto loan rates? Is it on the Fed's short-term rate? No, it's on that 10-year, right? So the market is telling you something different, and the market is telling you that they have some concerns. And I think mainly the concerns are associated on what you see on the graph. Since 2020, we've added $13 trillion to the national debt. So the market is worried about debt and the ability of this country to service its debt, right? So our debt servicing is higher than what defense spending, Medicare, you guys have seen the news, something along those lines. And our total debt as of the year end of 2024 is $36 billion. That's going to be higher than our GDP on an annual basis. But yeah, we've still got pretty good growth. That 2.8 was, I think, the second or the first estimate of third quarter, and it's now 3.1%. Okay? So that's kind of where we stand from a macro perspective, but it does impact you. It impacts you in three ways. Number one is in commodity pricing. Granted, today's market is probably most influenced by market fundamentals, but it wasn't that long ago in 2022 where we threw fundamentals out the window. Do you guys remember the spring of 22? Corn went to what? Corn futures went to north of $8, right? So it went from $6 to $8. It didn't matter whether it was too hot, too cold, too wet, too dry. It didn't matter whether you got the crop planted by the middle of May. It just didn't matter, right? That macro force, that inflation, took the price and ran with it. So that's what I mean there. Operating costs come in the form of interest rates and certainly land values. Most of your loans, well, I would say all of your loans, operating loans or otherwise, are underpinned by the value of the land that you hold. We haven't seen too many cracks in land values yet, right? That doesn't mean, however, that we won't. Financing costs are probably the one where it hits you the most, and you can see we've pushed into that 9% range. This is data from the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City that tracks agriculture. And interestingly enough, if you look at the graphic on the right-hand side, as a percentage increase, who's the leader in the clubhouse for all of the expenses in the ag sector? It's financing costs, up 70 some odd percent, as you can see with that dark blue line. So it matters. If you convert 9%, or basically the incremental 3%-ish that farmers have seen in terms of increase in their loan costs, it's probably $20 to $30 per acre on a gross margin type of operation that may push out $70 to $100 per acre on average. Not necessarily the last couple of years, but on average. Big impact. So all of these macroeconomic forces, and this is topic number one, I'm going to close it out. All of these macroeconomic forces do impact you at your farm gate. And don't think they don't. And in fact, more than ever. So the days of, walking in sunshine and running with unicorns at a 0% interest rate and financing your operations that way, those days are over. Okay? Topic number two, political winds blow. And you in this room will be impacted by the changes. And let me say before we jump into it, and the slides aren't particularly complicated, but when I talk about political winds blowing, they not only blow on the federal level, but they also blow on the state level. And what I mean by that, if you ever find yourself looking at the federal government and you see gridlock, even for your industry, look to the state. Because if the federal government and legislation is more gridlocked, that's where state actions come to the forefront. So just a pro tip there. Election outcomes. We have, as you I think have all seen and all know, we've had a change in administration. We'll have a change in administration January 20th, and the Republican Party will have a trifecta governing majority. Pretty good majority in the Senate, very, very slim majority in the House, and you've seen some of the ramifications and outcomes on the nightly news with that House and various constituencies and so forth. So we got a change coming. And the question is, what does it ultimately mean for agriculture? I want to talk about the state level. These are some of the changes that happen at the state level. No changes in the state of Illinois. But if you look at what I would call the overall footprint for agriculture, we have seen some changes there. What will they pretend in Congress? I don't quite know yet, but certainly they're out there. What is this new administration going to focus on? Look, we can sit here and speculate, right? And I'm not in the role of trying to speculate what will happen, but I think these are some of the key themes, and I don't think there's anything that's on this slide that comes as a shock to anybody in this room. But what is this administration going to focus on? They're going to focus on the regional conflicts, which would be the Middle East, Ukraine, Russia. They'll be dealing with immigration, security, the border, and trade. You've seen what they've done in the lame duck session. We've got a continuing resolution that keeps the Farm Bill in place until September of 2025. There was some ag disaster relief that also came as part of that continuing resolution. And then with the current leadership, you're seeing what I would call finalizing midnight regulations, or things they really want to do. They're trying to push into at the very last minute as much as they can. And that's kind of where we are. Lots of topics, I think, to explore. Immigration is on the docket. E15 is out there as a topic. Trade and tariffs. That's just the reality of the situation. They're going to have some type of impact on agriculture. But I think we probably still need to see how that's ultimately going to play out. And maybe that's something we can take up in the question and answer session as well, Kurt, and talk a little bit about that topic. But a big change, and a change that's not going to leave agriculture unscathed. Okay. Topic number 3, and this is a really important one, and it's all about how ag is transforming itself globally, what I like to call agriculture on the world stage. I've outlined 4 regions here that truly have an impact, I think, in our industry. If you look at the far left, we've got the United States there. What are we good at? We're good at large-scale production of commoditized products. We can get them to port, we can put them on rail, we can put them on truck, we can get them out of the country, and we're really good at technology. If you look to our friends to the south and southeast in Brazil, they're really good at growing corn and beans as well as row crops. They've got a lot of land, and they're not afraid to use it. So that's an important point. Infrastructure has always been a bit of the Achilles heel of Brazil. So how do you get product out of the interior and get it to the coast or to the port? They continue to improve there, but they're also dealing with currency fluctuations between the real and the US dollar. And that's something they deal with every day. And by the way, the Brazilian farmer is no different than anybody in this room. They're absolutely no different. They're trying to maximize margin, they're trying to maximize yield, and working daily to figure out how things will pencil out. Okay? Absolutely no difference between somebody sitting in this room and somebody sitting in Sao Paulo. Same type of meeting. If you look there further to the east or northeast, we've got Russia. Russia is an important player globally in agriculture, despite the Ukraine and Russian conflict. Certainly a prolific producer of wheat. and got a lot of natural gas and energy that are basically subcomponents for the production of fertilizer and the like. And then we look at China. Three of those four countries, we talk a lot about supply, but in China we talk about demand. So over the last 30 years, that giant sucking sound that you've heard is coming from China in the form of commodities. And it's not just agricultural commodities they've demanded, right? They brought in energy commodities and the like to support what was up until the last couple of years a burgeoning population and a consumption-driven population. But their demographics are changing, right? China of the last 30 years is not going to be the same country as China of the next 30 years, at least as it relates to agriculture. And again, that's a topic I think we're going to unpack here in just a slide or two. I want to focus on two countries off this map that I think are most important as we look over the next 5 to 10 years. One is, of course, China, but the second is Brazil. So let's dive a little bit deeper. In or about the mid part of the last decade, the 2015s, we saw a changing of the guard in terms of global trade flows. Right, we moved from one in which the United States was the king of soybean exports to one in which the United States is no longer the king of those exports. And a lot of that's driven by the expansion of the crop in South America. You look at the top graph, and this is acres, hectares, whatever you want to call it, and it's a unidirectional graph. It goes one way, and that one way is up. But the other point, and perhaps the more important point from this graph, if everybody can see it, look at those yield numbers for soybeans in the country of Brazil. I think it looks like 53.1. Let me look at my own map. 53.1 in the last year. Does that or does that not sound a whole lot like the average national soybean yield in the United States of America? Right on top of it, okay? So the ability to grow the crop and to yield out the crop in South America and Brazil is really strong. And this is a crossover point I was trying to make just a second ago. And this is basically global trade flows. The graphic on the left shows the United States in orange, and in blue is Brazil. And you can see they've really come on strong. They've really come on strong. Which means if we're not going to export as many soybeans and we're ceding a lot of that export trade volume to another country, what do we have to do? What do we have to go find for our own soybeans domestically? We got to go find demand, right? Luckily, we may have found one of those, and we'll talk about it in just a second. But I think the more pressing point is, not only does Brazil know how to grow soybeans, but they also know how to grow what? They know how to grow corn. If you look at the graphic on the right, and we look at global trade flows and exports of corn, right, we're kind of right on some of that same cusp. Quick question for the audience. I'll make it in ABC form so everybody can participate. Okay, no opt-outs. No opt-outs. Circa the early 1980s, what share of the global wheat trade was attributed to the United States? Global wheat trade, early 1980s. Was it A, 40%, B, 60%, or C, 80%? 40, A, 60, B, 80, C. All of you, those who think we had 40% of the global wheat trade in the early 1980s, raise your hand. A few brave souls. Again, no opt-outs. Option B, those of you who think it was more like 60% of the global wheat trade belonged to the United States, raise your hand. Looks like we're getting better participation. Excellent. All right. And finally, those who think it was 80, an astounding 80% of the global trade in the early 1980s, please raise your hand now. Wow. I'm counting less than 10 people who got this answer right. Congratulations. It's like 84%, right? Follow-up question. Today, fast forward 40, 45 years or so, what is the United States share of global wheat trade? Is it A, 40%, B, 30%, or C, 10%? Today, global wheat trade. Those who think it's 40%, raise your hand. So we went from 80 to 40. It's not a trick question. Those of you who think it's now 30% instead of 80%, please raise your hand. Okay, and finally, those who think it's more along the lines of 10%, raise your hand. And those of you who failed to participate, raise your hand right now. Okay. Well, the answer ultimately, I think, is like in the 11 to 12% range. So the reason I bring this up is you start to see trends. Other countries can produce a crop. Now, wheat can be produced almost anywhere, but you see a lot of the same trends happening in corn and soybeans. So as exports tail off, we have to find other demand for our products, right? If we want to keep the ball rolling. So that's why Brazil is so important. So let's transition from a supply country of high interest to a demand center of high interest. And that's China. So I said just a few minutes ago that China of the last 30 years will not be the same as the China of the next 30. Okay, and why is that? It's open mic night. She's on it. So think about it. It's demographic. So there are 3 D's at play, and I'll get to the other 2 D's in just a second, but the first D is demographics. And I think you see it on this slide. For the first time since 1960, China announced a decline in its population. I think it was 2023 when they announced that decline. First time. First time. And if you look at the graphic on the right, by the year 2030, there will be more individuals in China in excess of 65 years old than those who are 15 years old and less. Who do you think is going to consume more protein, corn, soybeans as a proxy? Those older than 65 or those 15 and under? That's right. I mean, you can see the shifts and they're right there in front of you. And it not only affects imports coming from the United States on the ag side, but Brazil and everybody else who produces this stuff. Same thing on the energy side. So we talked about demographics there for just a second. If you look at the GDP of China over the last 30 years, they oftentimes produced double-digit GDP types of numbers, right, as they were growing. But today, their GDP is much more akin to what you might see in the United States than you have seen in China over that long time scale. And you can see their GDP sitting there at 4.7% from the second quarter. Equally important is, the United States. We talked about this in that very first macro section, and we talked about the debt of the U.S. versus GDP. And I've superimposed China's similar numbers of debt to GDP, and you'll see they've got a pretty good growth rate. Pretty good growth rate in their own debt. A lot of their debt is tied up in real estate. A lot of the savings of the average Chinese is tied up in real estate, and I think they've got housing units to support 3 billion people, and yet the population is 1.4 billion, right? So demographics is an issue in China. Debt is an issue in China, right? And by the way, we've got our own debt issues, so I hate glass houses and launching some rocks out of them. So it's demographics, it's debt, and ultimately it's demand. The Chinese consumer doesn't demand a lot of the products that are produced in the country. It's a different perspective, whereas the U.S. consumer has a voracious appetite for stuff, right? So those are the 3 Ds, at least in my mind: demographics, debt, and ultimately demand for products and services in the country. So a question we often get, or I often get as well, is if it's not China, then who? Right? Probably ask yourself that in your industry. And the answer, or at least the follow-on question, is who? And oh, by the way, it's got to be India. And why does it have to be India? Has to be India because they're the population leader, right? They're now a bigger country, at least population-wise, than is China, right? So naturally, they're going to consume a lot of stuff and a lot of ag products that are converted into protein, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? But you have to understand India just a little bit better in terms of what their diet consists of. So you do have 1.4 billion people, but they're not all meat eaters, right? And that's what this graph breaks down. Out of the 1.4 billion people in India, uh, a third of them are strict vegetarian. Strict vegetarian. Another third abstain from meats. They might eat it one day a week, maybe 2 days a week. And then you've got the meat eater population, which is in that 300 million range, right? And that's only slightly smaller than the population of the United States, right? 340, 350 million, somewhere in that range. So this 1.4 billion super duper protein meat consumers in India is a bit of a mirage, right? So we, as a country, as the United States, we have to figure out where we can put our product, right? And it's not a single country, I think, that will be a replacement for the demand from China. I think it's going to be an amalgamation or an aggregation of several countries. There is no one country out there that replaces any demand lost from China. Okay, these are two key countries we continue to have to watch out for. On the supply side, I think it's Brazil. They're a ferocious competitor and a good, strong competitor for us. And then China on the demand side. It's a changing dynamic, not only for the United States and where their ag exports go, but for everybody else as well. Okay, let's move on to topic. What I think is what is this, number 4? Number 3, number 4, I can no longer count, but we'll get through it. Let's talk a little bit about agri-energy, because as we lose demand on the export side, right, which those previous graphs suggested, what can we do to spur domestic demand of the products that you guys grow every day, right? So here's the quick hit. All ag roads lead to fuel, and this concept of agri-energy. Obviously, we know with ethanol, a third of the corn crop goes to the production of ethanol, which is a fuel oxygenate added to gasoline at a 10% level, and there we go. But there is this new product called sustainable aviation fuel, or SAF, that could also create another demand angle for corn-based ethanol. There are hurdles, by the way, and we'll get into those hurdles, but basically what I'm showing on that crop is if you displaced or replaced 10% of the kerosene jet fuel used in commercial aviation today with corn ethanol-based SAF, that's another 8 to 10% of the crop. 8 to 10% of the crop. Okay. On the right-hand side, you've got what's happening on the soybean side. Today, roughly 50% of the soybean oil is going into biodiesel, renewable diesel today. If plans play out in terms of further development, further states tipping in, and I'll talk about this in just a second, we would use all of our soybean oil in the production of fuels. Again, these are the demand sources that I think are the difference makers for agriculture as we look over the next 5 to 10 years. This is a soybean crush, and no graph probably speaks to renewable diesel more than this graph. If you look on the left-hand side, let's see where that break is, probably November 21 or the year 2021, that's where we got things going in terms of soybean crush, really taking off, going to that $3 range, vacillating back, and so forth. Okay, that's a lot of the renewable diesel phenomena. Today, currently, we've backed off on crush a little bit. I think we're in the dollar. Current board crush was $1.32, and that's just based on futures prices. But again, if you look at long run averages, I know I've got $1.20 up there, but that's really including the last 3 years. If you take those out, the 10-year average for the soybean crush was probably in that 80 to 90 cent range. So with the advent of renewable diesel, as it relates to soybean crush, we probably had a step function increase of 30 cents a bushel to 40 cents a bushel. Okay. This is what is driving the potential increase in crush. You'll see the map on the left. Renewable diesel is driven by low carbon fuel standards. It started in California in 2009 and has continued to ripple across the United States. So today, low carbon fuel standards for which renewable diesel is supportive are in place in California, Washington, and Oregon, and New Mexico came on board with its own low carbon fuel standard in 2024. Okay, so we've ramped up this renewable diesel industry, and you see the graphic on the right. The blue dots on the left are where renewable diesel is produced. The dots on the right are either planned or expansion efforts in soybean crush facilities throughout the Midwest. So I think if you look at the production of renewable diesel and EPA limits or renewable volume obligation limits that have been set, we've reached those numbers, right? So we're at a little bit of an inflection point, I think, on renewable diesel. That industry came on and came up quickly. In order for this inflection point to continue to go up, however, I think we'll likely need more states to tip in with their own low carbon fuel standards. Places like Minnesota, states like Illinois, and even some of the New England states led by the state of New York. If those states begin to tip in, we're at this inflection point. We'd be off to the races again, I think, in terms of renewable diesel and ultimately utilization of soybean oil. So, all renewable diesel is not created from a feedstock called soybean oil, right? So we were all excited that soybean oil would drive this industry, and to a certain extent it has, but there's a fly in the ointment, right? And look at that graphic on the left. I basically reimposed the renewable diesel production locations. You'll see a lot of them on the West Coast in California. And they themselves are trying to figure out how to maximize their margin. And I think what they found is, hey, if I'm going to try to rail soybean oil from the Midwest and get it out here to my plant, is that more or less efficient than taking in some used cooking oil exports from overseas, bringing it into the port of Long Beach or other ports on the West Coast and refining that? And by the way, it has a better carbon intensity score. That's what's happened. You've seen it in the news, right? I don't think this is news to you guys. The graphic on the left shows used cooking oil imports in the United States, and they've absolutely skyrocketed. Again, tying back to political winds blow, right? Do tariffs have an impact on the amount of used cooking oil that comes into this country? Do state level political decisions on low carbon fuel standards have an impact? The answer is yes, they do. Yes, they do. Just a quick primer on sustainable aviation fuel. So this is an alternative to kerosene jet that is made out of a barrel of crude oil. And this whole concept is really driven by the airline industry wanting to decarbonize, have a low carbon footprint or carbon neutral, whatever you want to call it. And I've got the wheel of facts here, and I'll go through them. Number one, 2% of all global greenhouse gases are generated by the airline industry. And that industry is looking for at least a 50% reduction in their carbon footprint and looking for the right pathways to do it. It's not a one-for-one per se today. You can't run an entire jet on SAF. It's going to be a 50-50 blend today. Different from renewable diesel, by the way. And another couple of key facts there I've got love. That's a stock symbol for what airline? Spoiler alert, the tail is there in the picture. Southwest. And they've come out and said, look, by the year 2030, we want to displace, I think, 10% of our jet fuel and make it SAF fuel and not conventional kerosene jet fuel. United Airlines, based out of Chicago, or maybe DC, I can't remember these days, also is looking to expand and ramp up the production and ultimately the utilization of sustainable aviation fuel. But all of this SAF doesn't necessarily or can't necessarily come from corn-based ethanol, although we would like for it to. There are some hurdles for corn-based ethanol being converted into SAF, so let's talk about those real quick. So, what you need to do in order to qualify for the various tax credits to make SAF production profitable is come up with a carbon intensity score that is below 50% of what it would be with a barrel of crude oil. So on the left-hand side, The carbon intensity score for ethanol production today is about 50. You have to add on the processing for SAF to get a score of 70. If you're going to do this with corn-based ethanol, you've got to get that total number, that left-hand side number, below 50. That's where the tax credits kick in. And if you look on the right-hand side, this is a famous artist rendering of what happens to an ethanol plant. That was a joke. Seems to be lost. Okay. So we've got a graphic of a plant, and three things come out of that bushel of corn. We get 1/3 ethanol, 1/3 DDGs, and 1/3 of what? Carbon dioxide. Okay. So if you're an ethanol producer and you want to participate in the world of sustainable aviation fuel, or SAF, right? Another huge demand pool out there. You got to get this carbon intensity score down. How are you going to do it? A couple ways. Number one is carbon capture and sequestration, also known as CCS. Right? What state out of the 50 United States has a geologic formation underneath it that's suitable for CO2 capture and injection? What I hear, ILL, what are you guys supposed to say? That's not Illinois, but close enough. It's Illini. But yes, Illinois has that formation, as does North Dakota. Right? What state does not? Iowa. That's right. Where's a lot of our ethanol production today? Iowa, right? So one way for these folks, or for these ethanol producers, is begin to get their carbon intensity score down is to capture carbon, put it in a pipe, and inject it somewhere, okay, in the appropriate geologic formation. The other way to do it is to make sure that they have low carbon scoring corn as a feedstock into their process. And this takes me to the 45Z legislation at the federal level, the Domestic Clean Tax Fuel Credit. And it's offering SAF producers $1.75 a gallon for various incentives and meeting climate smart ag practices, right? So how do you guys participate, and how do you help create corn ethanol demand going into sustainable aviation fuel? It comes from these climate smart practices. I think there are three attributes. What were they? Nitrogen stabilization, cover crop, and no-till, right? You have to do all three of them, something like that. I think you guys weren't big fans of that last I checked. Doing all three, lots of yield drag. How much is it going to cost me? So this is all about 45Z in order to make this stuff happen. This 45Z legislation, as we go into the new administration, it's a little bit up in the air. This is kind of a Treasury issue, an IRS issue at the moment, and Treasury issue as to how to promulgate this program, how to structure this program. And by the way, this program ends in the year 2027. So we're running out of crop cycles to try to get this 45Z off the ground. So this is something behind me that I think is going to have a lot of influence by the new administration. Not sure which way it ultimately goes. Okay? You guys understand that to make corn ethanol go, we got to get the carbon intensity score in the right zone or the right spot. Okay, good. All right, so last section, and then I'm going to wrap it up. Maybe the most important section. I like to pull it all together, and the title of it is Ag as the Ag Cycle Turns, again, as the world turns. Right? It's another joke that seems to be lost on the crowd. And the bottom line is this: bearish fundamentals plus inflation are creating headwinds. They're creating headwinds for you at the farm gate. They're creating headwinds, probably Kurt, at the retail gate. If we've got any reps in the room that work with Syngenta or Bayer or Dow DuPont or Corteva, creating headwinds at that level, at the John Deere equipment level, and so forth. And this is the ag cycle in a nutshell. And you'll see this graphic goes back to the year 2003, and it shows average corn price as well as net farm income. So those blue lines are net farm income in the United States. That orangish line is the average corn price. A couple things to remember here. The average length of kind of that peak cycle in agriculture historically is around 3 years. The down cycle, the trough, is in that 5 to 6 year range. So you might think to yourself, wow, it's dour prospects, right? But remember this is not your first rodeo. Not your first rodeo. You just have to remember how to manage through that same rodeo that you managed through post what, 2012, 2013? Was the last time we had one of these? So it's not that far back in history. It's not like the 1970s graph we put up there. But this is where we find ourselves. And we got some trouble spots out there, and this, I think, quickly points out why we are where we are in terms of margin. So these are year-over-year comparisons. We've got seed up there, we've got urea, we've got phosphate, we've got crop protection on average, and we've got fuel prices. Seed prices, interestingly enough, are holding firm, right? Holding firm. If you look at urea year over year, not much change, but just slightly favorable. Crop protection's come off about 10%. Fuel is giving some relief in the 13% range. I've outlined there what ultimately makes up the overall cost and what their percentages are. So 20% goes to seed, 30% into fertilizer, 20% into crop protection. So all of your revenue is driven by the numbers on the right, right? And those red numbers look bigger than the green numbers that are outside the shaded block, right? A lot of shaking heads. And again, rough looking faces out there. And again, this is a situation we find ourselves in. And this is a situation that we've managed through before and will manage through again. But stuff happens on the way to managing through that process. And I think this is an interesting representation of the last cycle and decisions that were or were not made at the farm gate through this process. So you'll see the last peak in 2013 for net farm income in the United States. And you'll see we capped out there at about $164 billion. And you'll see the 2022 peak also, well, coming in higher at $193 billion. So what did farmers do to make it through the last downturn? Right? So, number one, new equipment was off the table. Right? Take what you got, make it last longer, or buy used. Show of hands. Anybody thinking about that? Nobody. Interesting. Okay. Second part. What was the reaction from the farming community? Lower application of fertilizer. We won't do any more hands. Clearly that's not working. So if you give me sort of the casual nod, I'll get the picture that, hey, that's crossed somebody's mind. Third, switching to cheaper seed or chemical applications. Anybody thought about that? Crossed your mind. Rent negotiations for those who don't own your land. Right? Anybody think about that? Input optimization versus yield maximization. I think it's that last point that, you know, as a farmer, it's second nature. I want to maximize yield, right? I want to do everything I can to maximize yield. And I think what happened in the last cycle, and probably what is important to you today, is not always think about yield maximization at all costs. Think about margin optimization, right? So will a $20 per acre application of X give me the 5 bushels incremental that I need to cover the cost, right? You've got to sharpen your pencils. You can't act like it's 2022 or 2023 and let 20 cents per bushel fall out of your pocket and not care. Those days are over. We're back into this cycle. So that puts a premium on being able to manage your margin. That puts a premium on knowing what your expense load is going to be. That puts a premium on knowing what your break-even costs that need to be achieved for corn or for soybeans. It means making a plan, setting a target, and sticking to it and managing through it. Okay, this is a process of margin management. We're not in 2022 anymore. Okay? Couple wrap up and take home thoughts here where I'll close out. Number one, we talked about the macro. Now more than ever, what's happening outside of the ag industry on the macro level of the United States and beyond, and even globally, they're more important than ever. You can't sleep on them. Number two, politics, changing administration, state level, federal level, are really critical to agriculture. Can't sleep on that either. Number three, we talked about two main countries of interest, China and Brazil. They're going to impact exports, both the U.S. participation in and competition from other countries. Number four, thankfully, lightning looks like it's going to continue to be striking twice. First was ethanol in the mid-2000s, and now we've got renewable diesel and the potential for SAF to help siphon off some of the crop that we grow. And then the fifth point there, we're in a down cycle. We've been here before. We've survived it before and come out on top. Just focus on managing your margins carefully and weathering the storm until we get this downturn turned back into an upturn. Okay? With that, Kurt, I'll turn it back over to you.